All right. Good to have Nathaniel back. I was asked, the shiur this week is sponsored by Eitan and Kayla Raps in memory of Eitan's grandmother, Sarah Rivka Bat Nachum Dov, on the occasion of her first yortzeit. So may her neshama have an aliyah. Sorry? Kiddush l'chaim, right? Yeah. Okay, we're starting a new Masechet this week, Masechet Bechorot. We finished Chulin, which we spent several months on. There's a lot of Agadah there, and now we're doing Bechorot. I think this week will be a bit more halachic than usual, but it's a sugya that I think is fascinating and worth spending some time on, even though it's not the usual comparing different midrashim. It's still something that there's a lot to discuss. And basically, we have this assumption in Torah that every word has meaning, every letter has meaning. There's kedusha to every word and letter in the Torah. Everything was given for a reason. And there are certain sections of the Torah where the Torah is verbose, right? Where it goes, there's certain sections where it doesn't say very much, and you kind of wonder why there isn't very much written. And then there are other sections where it goes on, and you wonder what the value is in the in the additional words. Two episodes two areas where that stands out in the Torah. One is probably, I think, arguably the construction of the Mishkan, the whole discussion about all the different kelim and everything that was built and the different amounts, and there's a lot of ink spilled on that. And then, of course, all the census, the times that Bnei Israel are counted throughout the Midbar, and all the details in the different families. There's kind of a lot of text dedicated to those sections. And what we're going to be dealing with now is a question asked Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai by a Roman officer, where he isn't necessarily bothered by how verbose these sections are, but by inconsistencies in the calculations, where there's in one section mentioned a certain amount, and then another section mentioned an amount that seems to contradict it, and he uses that as a springboard to kind of attack the authority of the Torah. We'll see Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's response. We'll see the halachic ramifications of that, and we'll look at some various mifarshim and midrashim that try to deal with it. Okay, so let's get started. The Gemara in Bechorot and Daf Hey Amud Aleph. Sha'al Kontrokus Hasar et Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Okay, Kontrokus, a name or a title, I assume a title. The officer asked Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Bifratan shel Levi'im atam motze 22,000. You know what? Sorry. Let's actually learn the psukim inside first, and then go back to the Gemara. Okay? So if we look at the second source, we have Bamidbar, Perek Gimel. It goes through account of the different families of Shevet Levi. So it says, LeGershon mishpachat HaLivni, LeMishpachat HaShim'i, Elehem mishpachot HaGershoni. So Gershon, there were two sons. There was Livni and Shim'i, and each of them were considered their own families. Pkudehem b'mispar kol zachar mi ben chodesh v'mala. Pkudehem 7,500. Okay, so the Gershoni was 7,500 people. You skip ahead. Likat mishpachat Amrami, Mishpachat Yitzari, Mishpachat HaChevroni, Mishpachat HaUzeli. Right, Kehat had 4 children, Amram, of course, being one of them. Elehem Mishpachot HaKehatib, Mispar Kol Zachar Mi Ben Chodesh V'mala, 8,600. Okay, Shomrim Mishmerat HaKodesh. So Kehat was 8,600. Limranri, Mishpachat HaMachlim, Mishpachat HaMushi, Elehem Mishpachot HaMerari. So, and then the third son of Levi, which is Merari. So he had 2 families. Pekudem, Mispar Kol Zachar Mi Ben Chodesh V'mala, 6,200. Okay, these are all Meforash Psukim. So you have 7,500, 8,600, 6,200. You add those 3 numbers up, you get 22,300 as the total number of Leviim ben Chodesh v'mala, a month and older. Then at the end of that whole section of those counts, it summarizes. It says, Kol pkudei Leviim asher pakad Moshe ve'Aaron al pi Hashem, le'mishpachotam kol zachar ben Chodesh v'mala, 22,000. Okay, so whereas each individual family would imply 22,300, the total is 300 less than that, and only 22,000, excuse me. The second source that we should look at is Shmot Perek Lamed Chet. This is talking about the conclusion of the construction of the Mishkan. Okay, so it's giving a summary, right, the counts of various things. So, Kol HaZahav ve'asur l'mlacha, v'chol melechet HaKodesh, v'yi zahav ha'tnufa, 920 kikar, ו-730 shekel b'shekel HaKodesh. V'kesef pkudei, this is the focus, v'kesef pkudei ha'eda, me'at kikar, ו-1,775 shekel b'shekel HaKodesh. The amount of silver that was gathered was 100 kikar, and then 1,775 shekel. Okay, and we'll get to the calculations in a second. Beka la gulgolet, machatzit shekel b'shekel hakodesh. And it was gathered half a shekel for every head. Okay, b'chol ha'over al pkudim miben 20 shana v'mala 600,000 u3,550. They did account for all the people in Bnei Israel. There were 603,550 people. Each of them gave half a shekel. So the number of shekalim would be half of that, 301,775. V'hi me'at kikar ha'kesef, לצקת את אדני הקודש ואת אדני הפרוכת מעד אדנים למעט הכיכר לכיכר לאדן. And here it says, and there were 100 kikar of kesef to use for various purposes. ואת 1,775, and then the remaining 1,775, אסף אבים לעמודים, was used for hooks for the poles, the pillars, וציפר שהן בחישה קותם, etc., etc. Basically, I broke it out here on the daf בכורות. What we have is, in source number 1, there were 603,550 males above the age of 20, and we're told each of them gave half a shekel, which is a total of 301,775. Okay? The psukim talk about me'at kikar, which is 100 kikar, but they also talk about other sums here, and we'll see if we jump back to the Gemara in Bechorot the problem. Okay, so starting over in Bechorot daf Amud Aleph. Shal kon chokus asar ador ben Yochanan ben Zakkai. בפרטן של לוויים אתה מוצא 22,300. In the delineation of each of the families of the Levim, you find 22,300. Right? We saw that math. בכללן אתה מוצא 22,300 להיכן הלכו. Where did those 300 Levim go? אמר לי, רבי יוחנן בן זכאי said back to him, אותן 300 בכורות היו, ואין בכור מפקיע בכור. In other words, the context of this passage in Bamidbar is counting the Leviim, because there was a ceremony that was done that Hashem said, you need to take all the Bechorot and redeem them with the Leviim. And there was a one-to-one, where if you count the number of Bechorot, you redeem them with the Leviim. And that was the purpose of this counting, of Ben Chodesh V'mala. The Torah tells us the number of Bechorot was 22,273. It gives an exact number. Okay? And the Torah even says, please don't do that, the Torah even says that there were only 22,000. Welcome. There were only 22,000. I don't have any more. Sorry. The Torah says there were 22,000 Leviim. There were 20,273 Bechorot. There were 273 extra Bechorot. They had to give money to Aaron and his sons to redeem themselves. Each one had to give 5 shkalim. Right. The first 22,000 they got off easy because they just got exchanged with a Levi. But then the remaining 273, which didn't have a Levi, those had to pay 5 shkalim each to Aaron and his sons. So what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is arguing here is that it's true that when you go and count each of the families of the Leviim, there's 22,300, but those extra 300 were themselves firstborn. And so since the context of this whole thing is to redeem a firstborn, and Bechor mafkia Bechor, so they were not included in the final count of the number of Leviim, which was, in other words, the purpose of redeeming the Bechorot. So it's true, each of the families, when you add up the sums of the number of people, it was 22,300, but the total for the purposes of redeeming the Bechorot was only 22,000. That's how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai resolves it. Okay?
Statistically questionable. 20,000 kids, only 300 of them
are firstborn?
Yeah.
It could be there was a lot of firstborn girls.
What, you think a family can't have 100 children?
I'm not so good at maths, it just sounds questionable.
It's a fantastic question. I'll say even stronger than that. Okay, the Torah says there's 22,273 Bechorot out of 603 something thousand people. So does that work as a ratio? More than 1 in 10. So 1 in.
It's not so crazy though, because that could be, if each family is having 8 kids, you could make that happen.
No, more. Yeah, more than 1 in 10. Like 1 in 12. Was it 1 in 20 even? Something like that.
Well, assume 50% of the firstborns are girls and 50% are males.
It's even worse then, no?
No, then there were more Bechoros per ratio.
Isn't this only...
You're right. All right. If there were half of them were girls, then it'd be, let's say, 44,000.
No, but isn't the whole number only boys in the first place?
He's right.
You know what?
The 600,000 is only boys. It's a good question. I will tell you, I heard this recently. This isn't here, but Rav Medan from the Gush asked the question, how could there only be 22,000 Bechorot for 600,000 males? And he suggested this is Rav Meidan, I would never suggest this myself. He suggested that in Makat Bechorot, we're never actually told that every Jewish family put blood on the posts. And we're never told explicitly that every Jewish family survived Makat Bechorot. In other words, he suggests that some Bechorot actually died in the 10th plague of Mitzrayim, which is interesting. That's why there's so few, relative to the number of Jews altogether. The Iyun Yaakov, we'll see, actually gives a couple of other suggestions of how to resolve this. But your question is a very valid one. Of the ratio doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai doesn't address it either. In other words, his suggestion is, these 300 are Bechorot, but compared to 20,000, that's a ratio of almost 1 in 100. That doesn't come up. So, good question. Okay. The Od Sha'alu B'gibui Kesef, and then the second question of Kontrokus to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is in regards to the second section we saw around the Mishkan. Atam motze 201 kikar, 11 maneh, dichtiv bekal hagulgolet machatzit shekel b'shekel hakodesh. So he says, in the first section, if you look at the pasuk, it says, v'kesef kudei ha'eda, me'at kikar, okay, it's 100 kikar, excuse me, in the Gibui Kesef Tamotzim 201 kikar, you see 201 kikar. Because it says, Bekal hagulgol machatzit shekel b'shekel hakodesh. Okay, so here we jump down to the numbers I put in the bottom. So, Kontrokos is basically saying, how much is a kikar? So you have these calculations here. A kikar is known to be 60 maneh, and a maneh is 25 shkalim, or slaim. Shkalim and slaim are identical. So the number of shkalim in a kikar is 25 times 60. You're just converting from the kikar to the maneh to the shkalim, which is 1,500 shkalim. So there are 1,500 shkalim in each kikar. So since there were 301 plus 1,000 total shkalim collected, and each kikar is 1,500 shekel, that means that you have 201 kikar, right? Because 1,500 times 200 is 300,000. And then plus another kikar for the 1,500, and then that leaves you with a little bit extra on top of that. That's 775, and then you get that 11 maneh, because each maneh is 25 shkalim, so 11 times 25 is the extra 275 shkalim. So Kontrokus says, we're told that it was bekal hagulgol machatzit shekel b'shekel hakodesh. That would imply 201 kikar with some change. Yet the very next pasuk says, me'at kikar vahi me'at kikar hakasef. So he asks, going back to the Gemara, Moshe Rabchem ganav haya o Kubiostus haya o eno baki becheshbonot. So he says, either Moshe Rabbeinu was a thief, or he was a Kubiostus. There's a debate in the Rishonim what that means. Rashi says it means a kidnapper, but the Rabbeinu Hananel says it means a gambler.
Yeah, I think that's their translations, by the way.
Yeah, Mesachik Bekubia, exactly. That's
gambling dens in the middle.
that, or he was a gambler. Yeah, that it makes more sense to translate it as a gambler because we're in the context of money, not in the context of dinei nefashot, which is why I think Rashi's translation is usually not accepted.
Unless he made the 300 disappear, may it be the piper.
The Bechorot. So that's going back to the Bechorot, right? Eno baki b'cheshbonot. He says, or I'll be done the kafschut. He wasn't a good accountant. Okay, but how else do you explain that half the funds for the Mishkan, that 200 kikar were collected and 100 were then used to build things? Right. So he says, Natan mechza v'natan mechza. He gave half of it, and then he kept half of it. U'mechza shalem lo echzir. And he didn't return a full half. Amar lo, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said back to him, Moshe Rabbeinu gizbar ne'eman haya. No, he was a trustworthy treasurer. U'baki b'cheshbonot haya. And he was a good accountant. U'maneh shel kodesh kaful haya. What's his answer? And this is the calculations here, 4 and 5. That according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the maneh shel kodesh is 50 shkalim instead of 25. So when you go back and you do the calculations now, you get to, okay, kikar is shishim maneh, as we saw, but then each maneh is 50 instead of 25 shkalim. So each kikar is now worth 3,000 shkalim instead of 1,500. And so instead of 200 kikar total, I get to 100 kikar total. So what that resolves the contradiction in the sense that the number of maneh used in the second section is double the first section, and then it explains the gap. Okay, so that's Kontrokus and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. If we look quickly at Bamidbar Rabbah, and I'll go back to the Maharsha in a second. So Bamidbar Rabbah has a different version of the same midrash, but it spells everything out explicitly. The truth is, we really said it outside, so I'm not sure. Maybe I'll skip through this or read it quickly, because we gave all the explanation outside, but the version in Bechorot is pretty lean, and then in Bamidbar Rabbah goes through all of the calculations. A couple interesting points to note here, and this is more along the theme of when we learn in Yaakov, noticing differences in different versions of the same midrash. So his title changes from Kontrokus Asar to Hongetim Hegemon, but he's still asking Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he says, Amar lo Moshe Revchem o ganav haya o lo haya yodea lechashev. Okay, the Kobiyostus is not here this time. Amar lo lama, Amar lo hongetim mipnei shayu asrim mishmei, etc., etc. And he goes and gives like a full explanation and detailing all of the gory details. One important point that's in Bamidbar Rabbah, which was absent from Bechorot, is if you skip to the fourth line, where it says mipnei ma in the middle of the fourth line. So the hongetim is saying mipnei ma otan 300 leviim hayiterim lo padu otam 273 bechorot haodafin al 22,000 bechorot she'anu motzin. So if you remember, we said there were 22,273 Bechorot, right? And then we're told, there are 22,000 Leviim. So it leaves 273 extra Bechorot. They had to give each 5 shkalim to Aaron and his sons. So Ongentim is saying, but really there were 22,300. It's just you gave a total at the end of 20,000, but those extra 300 is just enough to redeem those 273 extra that you said there's no Leviim to redeem, with 27 even left over. So why didn't those 300 from the 22,300 come and redeem the extra 273? So why did he do that, right? And furthermore, when he gave the sum of all the Levim, why did he remove the 300? הרי לא גנב אותן מן החשבון, אלא כדי שיתנו אותם 273 בכורות, 5 סלעים לאהרון אחיו. And here, Ongentim is much harsher than Kontrokus was, where he says, it's not just that Moshe was a gambler, or that he wasn't a good accountant. He says he's hiding, he's playing a game where he says, instead of, he counted them 22,300, he plays with the numbers. There's only 22,000. There's an extra 273 Bechorot. You got to give that money to Aaron, who happens to be my brother. So he's doing nepotism and on the highest order. That's what Ongentim is accusing Moshe Rabbeinu of doing. And then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai comes and says, no, those 300 were Bechorot themselves, ve'in Bechor mafkia Bechor, and therefore they weren't able to be used, and therefore Moshe's not doing anything here that's problematic. And then it says at the end, miyad nistalek mimenu, that somehow that appeased Hongentim, right? He didn't follow up with Shimon's valid question of what about the ratio of 300 to 22,000. That's the end of the conversation. The Maharsha, in his comments, basically takes this addition of Bamidbar Rabbah, of what the real oomph of the shaila is, and inserts it back into Bechorot, where it's not there explicitly. Right? So Maharsha, in his commentary on Bechorot, says, lama lo kirlani mashar, yiftu gam hem et ha-Bechorot. Alright, so that the 300 should also redeem the Bechorot, v'lo yizkukim ha-273 Bechorim ha-odafim minyan lepidyon. Ken Pirish Rashi b'Chumash, right? And he says that's what Rashi says in his commentary on Chumash. V'hainu, and the Maharsha says, shechashdu leMoshe she'asa ken le'ashir le'Aaron levanav. That the accusation is that Moshe did this in order to make Aaron and his sons wealthy by playing with the numbers so that there was extra funds that needed to go to them. Shikablu kesef pidyon shel 273 odafim v'kamelan. And the Maharsha kind of spells it out, what's spelled out in Bamidbar Rabbah, but it's absent from the version of the same Midrash in Bechorot. Okay. In the remaining 10 minutes, I will say up front that I didn't fully understand the commentary of the Yun Yaakov on this, but I want to learn quickly a sugya 2 dapim earlier in Bechorot and see a comment of Tosfot and a kasha of the Yun Yaakov. So earlier in Bechorot, on Daf Gimel Amud Bet, there's a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says something very simple, ostensibly. It says, Kohanim u'Leviim p'turim. The context of the first parak of Bechorot is Peter Chamor. The din of, if you have a donkey specifically, you have to redeem the donkey with a either with a sheep or you have to break its neck. And it's the only impure animal that requires redemption. Every Be'emat Torah requires pidyon, and the only impure one is a chamor. Okay? And the Gemara discusses why specifically a chamor, but it's not for now. So the question is, are Kohanim and Levim chayavim in Peter Chamor? We know that they're patur from Pidyon Ben. Kohanim and Levim don't have to do Pidyon Ben. And as we'll see, they do have to do Pidyon for Be'emot Teorot. So what about the Peter Chamor? What's the status? So the Mishnah says, Kohanim and Levim Pturim from Peter Chamor. Mikal v'chomer. I know it from a Kal v'chomer. In Pitru at Shel Yisrael b'midbar. So if the Kohanim and Levim were able to redeem Yisrael in the desert, Dinu shiftru at Shel Atzman. How much more so that they should redeem themselves? Okay? So this doesn't make a lot of sense. Why? Okay, the Gemara says, Inu pitre Adam Peter, Inu pitre Adam patar, Be'ema patra. Dichtiv kachat elevim tachat Bechor v'vnei Yisrael, v'et be'emat elevim tachat be'emtam. We're talking about Peter Chamor here. So what is the fact that the Leviim were able to redeem the firstborn humans of Yisrael have to do with whether they are exempt from Peter Chamor? It's 2 separate things entirely. So the Gemara says you have the idea of redeeming people, you have the idea of redeeming animals, and the Torah says, Kachet Leviim tachat bechor b'vnei Yisrael. So the Leviim can redeem the firstborns of Yisrael, and the animals of the Leviim will redeem the animals of the Bechorot. It's 2 separate things. So Amar Abai Hachi Kamar. This is what it means to say. Kohanim Leviim pturim behemtam mikal v'chomer. Let's reread the Mishnah. That the animals of the Kohanim and Leviim are exempt. Im ifkia behemtam shel Leviim behemah Yisrael b'midbar dinu shetafkia shel atzman. Right. That really we're not talking about the Kohanim and Leviim themselves. But we're talking about the animals of the Kohanim and Levim redeemed, the animals of the Bechorot in the desert. So they should redeem themselves, as it were now, from Peter Chamor. Amar le Rava, pitru inhu katani. Doesn't it say, not the animals, but the people? So it's not talking about the animals of the Kohanim and Levim, but the Kohanim and Levim themselves. Ve'or imita afil b'bechor be'emat Torah nifteru. And according to your logic, Rava says to Abaye, there's no reason to differentiate between Be'emat Torah and Be'emat Tme'ah. So if the animals of the Leviim are patur from the Kal V'chomer, from the fact that they redeemed the animals of the Bechorot back in the Midbar, so that should also apply to the Be'emat Torah, and therefore Kohanim should also be exempt from doing Pidyon for Be'emat Torah. Ala matnan, but then why does it teach? Lo nifteru mi bechor Be'emat Torah, ela mi Pidyon haben u'Peter Chamor. That Kohanim and Levim are exempt from Pidyon Ben for their firstborn male children, and for Peter Chamor, the impure donkey, but they are required in Bechor Be'emat Torah. So that differentiation doesn't make sense according to your logic, Abaye. Ela amar Rava. Rava says, Hachi katani. This is what the Mishnah really means to say. Kohanim u'Leviim patru hen atzman. They themselves are exempt, not in Peter Chamor, but in Pidyon Ben. That we thought we're talking about Peter Chamor here because that's the context of the first parak of Bechorot, but this particular Mishnah, Rava says, is talking actually about Pidyon Ben. And how do I know that the Kohanim and Levim are themselves exempt from redeeming their firstborn children? Mikal v'chomer. Im ifkia kedushatan shel Levim, kedushat shel Yisrael b'midbar, lo ifkia shel atzman. And now the Kal v'chomer makes sense in the sense that if a Kohen and Levi is able to redeem the Bechorot of Yisrael, so for sure they should be able to redeem their own Bechorot of their children, right? But then the question is, Be'emat me'ah minalan. So then for Rava, this whole Mishnah has nothing to do with Peter Chamor. So where does he learn the halacha that Kohanim and Levim are exempt from Peter Chamor? Al Makra, the pasuk says a totally different pasuk. Ach padot tifdeh et bechor adam et bechor be'emat me'ah tifdeh. There's a hekesh between the firstborn son by Kohanim and Bechor Tehema, Be'emat Temeah. Kol sheshno b'Bechor Adam yeshu b'Bechor Be'emat Temeah, v'chol she'eno b'Bechor Adam eno b'Bechor Be'emat Temeah. Basically, because there's a specific relationship between the firstborn sons and the Petach Hamor, so I learned from the firstborn sons to the Petach Hamor. Okay, so that's all the Gemara there.
I think there's a logical explanation, because what is the idea of the Tum'ah in general? It's a potential that didn't fulfill itself.
Okay.
So if you think of Bechor, or Bechor, and I'm speaking as a Bechor, that means if the Bechorot were to begin with up until Chet HaEgel were supposed to be there Lesharet B'Kodesh, and they missed their opportunity, and also the idea of Behemat Me'ah. Again, it's something that obviously, I guess, without going into the reasoning, is why a chamor, why a donkey, but still the whole idea of, it's still tum'ah, it's still echat me'ah, and it had a potential to become tahol or something, and it missed it out. It means the whole idea of tum'ah to begin with is a potential that didn't fulfill itself at the end of the day. So I think there is a connection between the chamor and the bechor. You can also connect also with the story where Yishmael stays with the donkey, where Abraham takes Yitzchak to the altar. Again, the whole if you think of it that way.
Sure. Yeah, the Gemara actually, I didn't bring it, but it asks why only donkeys is there the idea to redeem and not other impure animals. So it says Gezerat Katuv. It's just how it is. But having said that, it says in Yetziat Mitzrayim, everybody had a lot of donkeys, and so there's a connection between Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Petach Hamor. But it basically acknowledges that it's Gezerat Katuv.
Isn't it just one of the main non-kosher domesticated animals? There's not many other non-kosher domesticated animals. And that's common.
Is pretty similar to a donkey.
What?
He says a horse.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that in Egypt
I don't think
it wasn't
that was common there.
it wasn't used for a just a
Domestic.
something. No, it's something that you ride on. The horses were tied to a chariot. You mostly, you think of the, it's not something you just ride on or use for.
You're saying the average
person
Yosef
settling the land.
would
yeah,
wouldn't have a
it was
horse,
You think of the sus v'rochbo rama bayam. Yes.
but he would have a donkey. Yeah. So that's probably the logical explanation. Yeah.
Just
What does it mean that here בהם של לוויים בהמה של ישראל?
That's what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, Hashem commands Moshe Rabbeinu, Kach et Leviim, take the Leviim, Tachat Bechor b'Bnei Yisrael. So each Levi should redeem a firstborn Yisrael. Ve'et be'emat Leviim, Tachat Be'emtam. And then the animals of Leviim should redeem the animals of the Bechorot.
From what?
When are we done?
From what? I don't know.
Maybe Bechorot.
I mean,
Could be.
well, why do the Bechorot need redemption, right? I mean, the traditional explanation is that they did Chet HaEgel and Shevet Levi, didn't do Chet HaEgel, so them and all of their property is included in that sin. So even their animals needed redemption. Yeah. I didn't look into that. It's a good question. Maybe the Mefarshim have something more intelligent to say about what's the idea behind redeeming the animals as well. Okay, we're almost at time. I will try very quickly, even though this is the part that I understood the least, to just talk about Tosfot in the Yun Yaakov. I won't get to the Chidushei Gaonim. So Tosfot asks the following question. So the Mishnah said, Kohanim and Leviim are exempt from a Kal V'chomer. If they redeemed Israel in the desert, so for sure they themselves should be exempt. So Tosfot asks a fairly straightforward question. He says, V'im Tomah, Velo kal v'chomer. Why does the Mishnah need a kal v'chomer here? Tepok le mitoch kontrolkus asar demeshane otam 300 bechorim hayu ve'en bechor mafkia bechor mishum dedayo sheyafkia et atzmo. In other words, the reason that Kohanim and Levim are pturim from Pidyon is because they redeem themselves. And you don't need the kal v'chomer. You can just say that they Shema minad shel atzmo miyam mafkia, right? That the Levim, the Kohanim and Levim themselves uproot the need to do Pidyon. So why do I need the kal v'chomer of the Mishnah? Yesh lomar I lav kal v'chomer. If I didn't have the kal v'chomer, matzinu lishnuye, we would have taught otam 300 bechorot hayu. That we would have taught, okay, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai taught that those extra 300 Levi'im were themselves Bechorot, v'hutzruchu pidyon. But despite the fact that they were Bechorot, they still themselves would have needed redemption. V'chi tema im ken le'manyinhu b'hadesh 73 odfim. And if you would tell me, then why doesn't the Torah include them in this? Okay, there's an extra 273 Bechorot of Yisrael, and then you have these 300 Bechorot of Levinim who need redemption. That the Torah was already talking about all the Yisraelim that needed redemption, so it didn't include the Leviim. That's what Tosfot argues. Okay, we don't really have time to get into it, and also I didn't fully understand it. But the Yun Yaakov basically, the reason I found this interesting was because he completely rejects Tosfot's question. He says, he uses a pretty strong language, right? He says, "V'katvu Tosfot, etc., etc." Okay, where he says until Ad kan lashon Tosfot on the 6th line in the middle of the line, 3, 4, 5, 6. He says, "Divrei Tosfot chukim meod." He says Tosfot's question is very problematic. He says, He says, if it's true what Tosfot argues, that if I didn't have the kal v'chomer of the Mishnah, then those 300 Bechorot Leviim would have actually needed redemption. So then why wouldn't the Torah have mentioned that? Right? The Torah doesn't seem to relate to that at all. And it seems strange to say it's because it would have assumed you understood it from a kal v'chomer. And even more difficult, and then he says, and just conceptually this is difficult, because you're saying that the firstborn of the Leviim are less important than the firstborn of the non-Leviim. The Bechorei Yisrael haya begoral, because the Bechorei Yisrael, there's 22,273 of them. And how did they decide which 273 had to give money to Aaron and his sons? So it actually doesn't say in the Torah how that decision was made. Yaakov assumes it was a lottery. So the 273 unlucky ones had to give money. The rest got off scot-free from the redemption of the Levim. Right? Begoral, imala be'ado ben Levi. So if someone through the lottery got a Levi connected to him, Amar kvar b'dalcha ben Levi. So you'd say, you already got redeemed from a ben Levi. You wouldn't have to give the money. But the other 273 did have to pay Aaron. Right? But the 300 Leviim were not part of that whole discussion. If Tosfot's right that really they would have needed a pidyon, so then all 300 of them would have had to have given a pidyon. There was no concept of them even being able to get out of that through being paired up with somebody. I looked up this phrase. It's from Gemara Bava Kama. It basically means that the resident is on the earth and the stranger is in the sky. In other words, there's something backwards here where the low status person is higher up than the higher status person. Right? The Leviim should have a better chance at being redeemed than the Yisrael. And here if Tosfot's right, it's the opposite. At least the Leviim should have had a chance to get out of having to pay if this was true. Okay, V'Hashem he'ir einai, and then Yun Yaakov says, and Hashem, and Yun Yaakov lived in the 1800s. Right? He's talking about a question on Tosfot. There's some holy chutzpah here, I would say. Hashem opened up my eyes. I'm not sure what that Rashi Tevot stands for. The ilav kal v'chomer. If it weren't for the kal v'chomer, have amin, I could have said, zayarak 150 Bechorei Leviim, that instead of 300, there's 300 extra. I may have thought of those 300, it's not that all 300 were firstborn, but 150 of them were firstborn. Upeda'an 150 Leviim. And then those 150 firstborn redeemed the other 150 Leviim. Hapshutim, Hanotarim. So there's 300 left over, but none of them are available to redeem the Israel because 150 of them redeemed another 150 of them. There were only 150 Bechorot, or Bechorim, and they redeemed another 150 Leviim, and that left 22,000 to redeem the Bechorim, the Israel. And they didn't need to enter into the Goral at all. That's why they're not included in the final count. But because of the Kal V'chomer of the Mishnah, now I understand that Leviim just don't need redemption. I don't need 150 to redeem another 150. There's no concept of a Levi needing redemption at all if he's a Bechor. That's why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said that really there were 300, all 300 were Bechorim, and not 150 who redeemed 150. And he says, Dokshu barur v'nachon. Right? So he says about his own pshat, know that this is correct. Tosfot left me a place to challenge and overrule them, essentially. And just to finish this, and this will conclude, another option, the Piduyei Leviim Hayu. כדכתיב, היו לי לוויים במקום הבכורים, והקדוש ברוך הוא לא היה חפץ בלוויים. רק ב-220,000, רק בכ"ב 1,000, שהם כנגד מחנה שכינה, שהיא כ"ב 1,000, כדכתיב, רכב אלוהים רבותיים אלפי וגומר. So the second answer is no, that the idea was Hashem wanted a redemption of 22,000 for 22,000. Because there's this concept that 22,000 is the number of the Machaneh Shechina. And he brings some sukkim to support that. That's why he kept it at 22,000 instead of the full 22,300. Revkem. And another option is that the extra ones were swallowed up as part of Korach's rebellion, because we know that Korach, the followers were from Shevet Levi. It's not clear to me how that explains why the census in Bamidbar, which happened earlier, they would have been excluded, because that Korach happened afterwards. So even if in the future they would get swallowed up, they still should have been included earlier on. And also in general, I think there's some open tzarech points to this analysis of the Yaakov. But we are over time. So again, just to conclude, so we have this, I think, rather interesting sugya of a discrepancy in the math alongside a very suspicious ceremony that happens in the desert, and it's placed in the mouth of Kontroku Sasar, or in the mouth of Hongentim Hegemon. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has to defend why Moshe acted the way he acted, and we saw that really the accusation is around the fact that Aaron receives some extra money for the extra Bechorot that were redeemed. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai comes and explains that really ein Bechor mafkia Bechor, and that has halachic ramifications and is used in the discussion of Petach Chamor and Pidun Haben. Shkoyach.